by giving you a little background on who I am and what I hope to bring to you guys. The introduction was helpful because it sounds like I'm in a room full of people that kind of already have experience with trauma. My position I had before the Access and Wellness Services Director was the Evidence-Based Practice Manager at the Los Angeles Child Guidance Clinic, and that my job entailed knowing all of the evidence-based practices that LA County had adopted, LA County DMH had adopted, and which ones we wanted to implement and apply to our population. We have a population right across the street from USC, and we have we're in the service area 6. It's a a disadvantaged population, largely Latino and African American, experienced a lot of adverse events and traumatic events across their lifespan. So we focused a lot on trying to be a trauma-informed community. And so a lot of my experience and what I'm going to bring to you today is similar to the stuff that I have been working on for the past several years as the evidence-based practice manager. What does an evidence-based practice do? What is an evidence-based? How can we use that focus on trauma? I've listed a handful of those, and I'll go into some detail about those. If folks have more experience with them, you may have more experience than I do with some of them, based on my age, the age ranges that I've worked with, and I'm happy to open a discussion on that. As the Access and Wellness Services Director, I'm responsible for managing the intake program. We have a no appointment necessary walk-in clinic. Folks walk in off the street, they get referred by schools, they get referred by doctors, probation, DCFS. And one of the things that we found is people they're not necessarily aware of why they're there. They're not necessarily aware that that sleep problem or that eating problem is actually a sign of a mental health issue. And so a lot of times they'll come in and say, I don't have any problems. And so what I've focused on with my staff is trying to do, cast the net kind of wide, do a broad assessment as possible, come up with as many different possible avenues to go in and see what help your client, your applicant, uncover what might be the cause of the impairment. And I've been doing that for about 3 years. I did the evidence-based practice thing for about 5 years, and I'm the director now over here for about 3 years. I hope that this will be at the level that you guys want it to be at. I know I have about 45 minutes to get all this stuff in there, and then you guys are going to ask some questions. So I understand it's going to be a little bit briefer than a 6-hour seminar, but I do enjoy the opportunity to come out for an hour in the morning and have a cup of coffee and kind of get the day started with some creative thinking. No, I did remind you that. I've also been in private practice for about 15 years in Santa Monica and have translated these practices to my private practice as well. How's the volume? I'm not used to the microphone. It's not karaoke. How many people are familiar with the ACEs study? Oh, good. I don't have to go into too much detail. But the idea behind the ACEs study, which I think was really groundbreaking, people across all walks of life experience a number of adverse events, and they kind of piece some puzzle pieces together to say, hey, I might have experienced 1 or 2 things as a child or as an adult, and then later on I have these medical problems, or I have these mental health issues, or I have these community impairments, like it's harder for me to get a job, it's harder for me to finish my education. But if you're not paying attention to those adverse events in childhood, you don't make that connection. And so one of the things that I think is important for intake coordinators and people who are providing treatment as well is recognizing how, the kinds of questions you need to ask about childhood experiences. One of the things that we do at LA Child Guidance Clinic is we have the ACEs study screener, the trauma screener. It's public domain, so you can have a copy if you want, or we can email it to you if you're trying to contact it. We added a couple of things to that, so we added things like immigration. Equifinality, this is one of my favorite classes in my master's degree was developmental psychopathology. For all you developmental psychopathologists, I learned about equifinality and multifinality. And it's an important term to remember because you're thinking, somebody walks through the door, if you're a ever treated a client that walked through the door and say, I don't know why I'm here, or if you're working with a child and the parent brings the child in, they're usually going to focus on observable signs. They're going to say it doesn't follow directions, or they're hyperactive, or they're just not doing well in school. I think what happens with caregivers or school teachers or people that are less trained in mental health issues, they'll focus on observable behaviors and they'll say this is what I'm concerned about, the observable behaviors. Equifinality refers to a term that means similar results can be achieved with different initial conditions. So I experienced physical abuse, my parent was deported, I got teased at school, I had an illness, so all of these different starting points could lead to the same outcome. In this case, what I'm talking about is trauma. So the idea is be mindful of all of the possibilities, not just whatever the person coming in is presenting to you that they think you want to hear. So that's why at LHL Guidance Clinic we've adopted this trauma-informed lens. Kind of the way I describe it to folks is universal precautions if you're in the medical field. So universal precautions say you don't put on the gloves for the person that you think might be sick, you put on the gloves for everybody. And then that way you protect yourself universally and you don't risk offending any specific individual. So we also assume, and everybody walking through the door, they have experienced some traumatic event, some adverse event. And so the idea is, again, same observable signs: hyperactivity, poor academic performance, mood swings, sleep disturbance. They can be due to a number of different things. It could be attention deficit disorder, it could be physical abuse, parental separation, immigration, substance abuse, bipolar disorder, something like that. So again, people are going to focus on specific aspects, the observable signs, and you want to dig a little deeper and make sure that you're doing a good assessment. But also, let's see if I got trauma-informed here. Here it is. Sort of assuming on the way in the door, you're meeting with somebody, this is how we address people, is we assume that they have some adverse or traumatic event. And so the signs that you're seeing may be something they've developed over the course of time. Say if I'm 10 years old and I experienced some kind of violence when I was 5 years old, but I've been accommodating to it for the last 5 years, it doesn't look exactly the same as post-traumatic stress disorder. So you might see just the hyperactivity, you might see just the numbing and avoidance, you might see just difficulty with attachment or following directions. And so we really focus on trying to uncover any kind of potential traumatic event, and that starts with the person, at the door. Our guards are warm and welcoming, the receptionists are warm and welcoming. They recognize that somebody coming to your clinic or somebody seeking services, they may have their own obstacles to treatment already, and I can go back a slide for that. They may, implicitly, not explicitly, implicitly be a little bit nervous about talking. Like, that's one of the fun things about trying to assess for trauma. If you actually have post-traumatic stress disorder or trauma, one of the symptoms is trying to not think about the trauma. And so trying to report to a clinician, hey, what's the problem? Oftentimes that can be difficult, especially for children that may not have verbal capacity if it happened when they were a child. So just making sure that environments are warm and welcoming, and that if you have like soft and soothing music, and making sure all staff are trained. We have our security guards and our facility staff and our receptionists are all trained to assume somebody walking through the door has experienced an adverse event. And that way, when the tone of their voice goes up, we know it's not, trying not to react, trying not to be overreactive. And then thinking about the experiences that they have, how many times do you have to write down on a piece of paper the event that you're here to talk about? How many people do you have to tell? How long do you have to wait before you get to talk to a clinician? So it's an interesting challenge that I've experienced. So I have a private practice. You call me, you say, hey, I want an appointment. I say, okay, your appointment is Thursday at noon. I see you come in, you flip the little light switch, and it takes me about 10 or 15 minutes to come out and say hello, and we get to work. In community mental health, you talk to the receptionist and they hand you a form. And you fill out the form and they say somebody will be with you in a moment. And then in our clinic, we have a case manager or family advocate come out and do a triage to make sure you're in the right building. We have a lot of people that are referred for speech therapy or they're referred for autism, and we're not credentialed for that. So we say, rather than wait in line, we might want to give you some referrals. And then after that, we have the therapist meets with them and they do their own assessment. So this person has come in and they've written it down on a piece of paper and they've talked to a case manager and now they're talking to a therapist. They probably filled out some outcome measures and consent forms and HIPAA forms and beneficiary grievance forms and anything required for Medi-Cal. And 3 hours later, we're up to opening the case and your therapist will see you next week. And so being mindful of that, we're trying to expedite that process as much as possible, because if you're an anxious person who has difficulty regulating your emotions, has difficulty trusting people, isn't really sure about yourself, not really sure if I'm in the right place, every minute that it takes between the time they decide to get treatment and the time they're actually sitting in a chair with a therapist, it increases the potential for dropout. And so one of the things about a trauma-informed care is just kind of being mindful of what's the experience of the client who's coming in and how can I make my environment as warm and welcoming as possible. So as I mentioned, there's a number of different obstacles. So the obstacles to even assessing for trauma, you've got obstacles in the client themselves. Like I mentioned, I've been doing my best for the last several months to forget what happened to me, and now you want me to talk about it. And so sometimes I'm going to focus on the observable signs, or sometimes I'll say, it's not a problem. One of the things that I dealt with very recently was a teenage Latina who was saying, everybody I talk to about it says, yeah, that's pretty common and I should just get over it. And so if I'm going to talk to somebody about it, that might be a sign of vulnerability or weakness, and I don't cry. And so you're trying to overcome that obstacle to get them even in the door to begin with. The caregivers of children. So admittedly, I work at LHL Guidance Clinic for child, and so we work with a lot of children. This also works for adults. They may have their own history of trauma. So one of the first things I ask about whenever I hear a child has experienced physical or sexual abuse is I also want to know what the parents' experience of physical or sexual abuse. Oftentimes, I think statistically, although I don't have any statistics on it, oftentimes, again, remembering that one of the signs of trauma is this numbing and avoidance. And if I've been traumatized myself, I am going to be trying to block out thoughts or feelings related to trauma, and then when it is actually occurring to my child, caregivers can miss it for that reason. They're doing their best to avoid their own traumatic events, and by trying to contain or compose themselves, they miss that their kid's disruptive behavior might be related to a traumatic event that they've had. I've had number of parents, so there's one that I'll talk about, child-parent psychotherapy in a few minutes, and I had a conversation with a parent recently who, you've got the word parent in there, and they say, well, it's not my fault. Why am I in a parenting program? I'm a good parent, my kid was traumatized, and why are you accusing me? Or, so there is a sense of responsibility or a sense of guilt that caregivers have to overcome. Sometimes they're defensive about that as well. So it's hard to get to what actually happened and what's the system, the family that allowed, that did not promote seeking services sooner. Immigration issues is a new one. It's one where the environment is a little bit more tense because as a parent who is not a naturalized citizen, they may be a little reluctant to talk about anything related to their child because they think maybe DCFS is going to be called, or maybe ICE is going to be called, and they have a misunderstanding of what we do for a living. So that is one issue that I've had to overcome as well. And then in the providers, this was one that I remember for anybody who has worked with trauma, it's a difficult thing to hear your client's story. And you've gone into this field, presumably you've got a couple of empathic cells, and to hear your client's traumatic story over again can have an effect on the therapist. We talk about vicarious trauma, we talk about self-care, but there are times where therapists, clinicians will evaluate their client to move forward in a trauma program, but because of their own sensitivity, they might say, oh, maybe my client's not ready, or I don't think they can handle it, so I'm going to stay in this safe realm of, talking about what the problem that you had last week versus coping skills. Trauma-informed screening. Okay, so one of the things that I do appreciate about paperwork is if I'm a therapist and you have a family that walks through the door and they say the kid doesn't follow directions, the way I kind of think about the DSM-5 and trying to do diagnosis is you're trying to, you've got a tree full of different possibilities, and every time somebody mentions something or mentions that doesn't happen, you're pruning a leaf off the tree, and you're kind of whittling your impression down to, nope, this is what it is. So if they walk through the door, it could be anything. And the moment they say, no, I'm not depressed, okay, so now I'm not going the depressed route, I might go the anxious route, I might go the trauma route. And sometimes we're wrong. Like I said, sometimes we focus on the thing that the caregiver is presenting or the thing that's most important to the client. I came in because I broke up with my girlfriend, but what you're not talking about is you've had a lifetime of historic or chronic trauma that makes it difficult for you to attach. You weren't able to be empathic with your girlfriend, and so lo and behold, you're not dating her anymore. That's a long pathway, but your client may start with, gee, I just want to feel better about my breakup with my girlfriend. So the advantage of having screeners, like I mentioned, this is the trauma screener adapted from the ACEs study. There's also a handful of other public domain ones that I brought. This is the revised child anxiety and depression scale that was developed by Bruce Torpedo and Matt. And this is the PHQ-9. It's developed by Pfizer, the people that brought you Prozac. And those are public domain screeners. They're easy to fill out. And the idea is that you may have a preconceived notion of what this client is kind of dealing with, but these don't. The pieces of paper don't. They just ask the questions. And so you don't get kind of pigeonholed. Your thinking doesn't get pigeonholed in the wrong direction. I'll give you a good example. I think we had a client about a year ago, and he wasn't eating, and he came in for an intake, and we're trying to decide he may or may not have expressed some suicidal ideation. He expressed it to one person, but then he recanted with the other person, and he said, no, I was just joking. And everybody who had contact with him kept thinking there was something just unnameable about him, like we don't trust him. So if he says I'm suicidal, we didn't really trust that. If he said I'm not suicidal, we didn't really trust that. Now we're trying to decide, are we calling the PMRT team? What, are we doing a safety contract with him? And ultimately what we decided was none of us felt remarkably comfortable with his being a historian, and so we would rather have a third person come in and evaluate him. And remember I said he wasn't eating, and so that was one of the signs. So naturally we're thinking depression, we're thinking eating disorder, something like that. And we asked all the questions we could, and still didn't get a really good vibe for it. And so then the PMRT team came in, and one of the questions they asked was, what's wrong with the food? And he said, oh, everybody's poisoning. That would have helped if we had thought in that direction, but that did not occur to us because our thinking had been pigeonholed towards things typically associated with eating, like loss of appetite with depression or eating disorder. So screeners like this can be helpful because it kind of makes sure that you don't go down the wrong pathway. The two things about screeners, one is oftentimes they will have questions in there about suicide. So I have run into people that are happy to fill out any box that you want, and they'll check off, I think about suicide every single day. But they're not comfortable telling a human being. And so they basically just reported suicidal ideation. If you don't read that, you just had somebody report suicidal ideation and then leave the building. The other thing that we found, not a lot of the time, but I do have one story about like a child, if you're filling out a trauma screener, the parent might be aware of one of the traumas that they're bringing the child in for, but they may not be aware of all of them, or they might be telling you about the one that they didn't do, and the child is going to report the one that they're responsible for. So, child and family were in a car accident, and the parents say, oh, I just want to make sure my child is fine. They bring them in, and the mother fills out, oh, we're here for the car accident. The child fills it out, and they're checking boxes about car accidents, about physical violence, about watching pornography with their family or something. And so the children will report things that are going on in their home that may trigger a further abuse report. So be mindful of screeners yourself before the children leave them. So I tried really hard to find a good picture of an iceberg that gave me a lot of room so I could put some words in there. And then here's this is a really long link to get to where I got some of this information from. Not thrilled with the way the slide went down, but I think it gets the point across. The tip of the iceberg is the stuff that's observable. The tip of the iceberg is going to be the stuff that either caregivers or adults are going to be recognizing. And it's usually the stuff that bothers them. So my child was traumatized and they're hyperactive. I'm less observant, less aware, and it impacts me less about their anxiety. They're going and rocking in the corner. That's not a problem for me, but it's when they're hyperactive and they're not following directions. And so they'll walk through the door and they'll say, these are the things that I'm observing. So let's see. I spent so much time, maybe I should read it. It's often the externalized observable behaviors that lead to a diagnosis. Children can be misdiagnosed with ADHD, bipolar disorder, or both, and oftentimes they overlap. So a child, for example, who's ADHD, they're hyperactive and impulsive, they do get into more trouble. They get into more trouble. Sometimes they take risky behavior, they have risky behaviors, and they do wind up experiencing an adverse event or some trauma, and so they may indeed actually have both. And then this is the link down here. There is a sample of 65,000 children, 17% with ADHD had 4 or more adverse child events versus 6% of children without ADHD. So it's just possible that because of the comorbidity, they're more vulnerable to increased trauma. Men and boys of color often misdiagnosed as oppositional conduct disorder or antisocial behavior. Again, because you're focusing on the external behavior.
And
question?
Yeah, so when you say you had 4 or more cases, and then you said 6% of children without ADHD had less than 4, or had 4 or more, so it's on the 4, it's not like the number is the same?
Sample, 17% of children with ADHD had 4% or more versus 6%. So 6% of the children without ADHD had 4 or more. 17% had 4 or more if you had ADHD. So what is that? Math? 11% difference. So ADHD increases.
I mean, I asked that because in schools you see ADHD as sort of like everywhere maybe, but you see schools saying, oh, they got ADHD, and then the trauma piece is just forgotten about. And,
right.
And I think the challenge of bringing in the trauma piece kind of conflicts with the ADHD thought process.
Right. And I talk to my clinicians, and it's tricky. I talk to my clinicians a lot because one of the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder is hypervigilance, hyperactivity, dysregulated behavior. And so I caution them, don't diagnose every kid that walks through the door with ADHD because they're a little, excessively active. Follow up and find out if some traumatic event happened, but also that doesn't mean that they still don't have ADHD. So you're trying to look at multiple systems, multiple settings. You're trying to look at cognitively, are they distractible as well as hyperactive, impulsive? You're trying to get a flavor for the level of energy. Is it like excitable and running headlong into some fun, exciting thing without thinking of the consequences, versus the sort of tense, over energy, hyper-vigilant kind of level of energy? Aggression, impulsive behavior, substance abuse, abuse, relationship problems, overeating. These are ways of self-soothing. So again, you're looking at, if I were overeating, you might be looking at a depressive disorder or an eating disorder, but is it a way of self-soothing? Aggression, is it intermittent explosive disorder? Or is it, am I protecting myself because other people have been physically violent with me? Somatic symptoms. All right, trauma-informed LEMS, prevention and early intervention. So got a couple of different options when you get to this point. One of the things that we're trying to do is figure out, like, by the time an adverse event has already occurred, there's a chance that they've developed an adjustment disorder, acute stress disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, or thank goodness for the DSM-5 that now has other trauma and stress-related disorders. But if there are more things in the community that a child can be exposed to, that could also increase protective factors. So they may have an adverse event, but because of my involvement, say with the JCC, I didn't experience, I can experience trauma, but I didn't develop into post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm gonna have to go for the Gatorade. So one of the things that we educate all of our families about is, what does trauma look like? So that's one of the first things that anybody's going to do in any kind of a treatment, is just to say, hey, have you ever experienced an event? And did you know these are the several areas of functioning that it will affect? It will affect your ability to regulate your emotions. It affects your ability to attach and connect to people, sometimes overly attached, sometimes avoidant and withdrawn. It will affect your sense of self. So people will feel like I'm helpless, or they'll feel like I can't really do as good a job as I want to do. They'll have, typically they may have less well-developed coping skills. The coping skills that they're used to that work the quickest are usually anger and aggression, or avoidance and withdrawal. There's some in-between area there. So there are a couple of things. This is, if you suspect somebody has experienced a traumatic event, they don't necessarily need 16 to 20 sessions of trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. There's brief problem-solving therapy, crisis-oriented recovery services. The idea behind it, and I like the idea of crisis-oriented recovery services from the Benjamin Rush Center and Dee Dee Hirsch in Culver City. They think of it as a timeline. You know, an event happened, and at some point, each person starts to accommodate to this traumatic event. And if you don't get to them soon enough, it's more of a treatment rather than a protective factor. So the wound scabs over. And so they talk about having an identifiable stressor, and then within 3 months there's a trigger. And that trigger causes you to come in and seek therapy like yesterday. So today is a very important day. And starting today, you've got about 4 to 6 weeks, depending on who you ask, 6 to 8 weeks I think they extended it to try to make sure that bone heals the right way, to make sure that that wound scabs over the right way. Otherwise, whatever accommodations they've made are going to have more lasting effects. I had a friend of mine who, he injured he had like a tack on the bottom of his foot. And so he was constantly like limping on his left foot for several months until the bone healed or something that he had to do. And so then he had to go to physical rehabilitation to remind himself how to walk using both legs. So that's the idea, is if I get in there quick enough, they don't make that accommodation. They say, a bad thing happened, I have wonderful supportive people, I understand it, I'm moving on. And that's more like the crisis-oriented recovery services. 4 to 6 weeks, not 4 to 6 sessions. So it's a time frame. You start from the moment the client reports the stressor, and you strongly reinforce with your client that you have 4 to 6 weeks to kind of come in here and process through this. Otherwise, it becomes more of a treatment process rather than a prevention process. And again, community-based care, increased protective factors, you're making connections with supportive people. One of the outcomes of a lot of longitudinal studies is for children that have experienced traumatic events or any kind of disadvantage. Several of the one protective factor that comes up a lot is having at least one supportive adult in the community. It could be my therapist or my case manager, could be a school teacher or coach. So trying to get them connected with as many people as possible that might be that at least one supportive, happy person in their life. Ideas. that, so when I created the slide, I don't know if Zumba existed, when they did that research in 1980. Tutoring, creative arts, parenting and support groups, recreational athletics, preschool, after-school programs, religious and spiritual organizations, all ways that people can be involved in different activities that might not prevent them from having the adverse event, but if that does occur, they have somebody they can talk to, and that is a protective factor. All right, so then you've done your screening, and you've identified a child or an adult who has experienced an adverse event. Maybe they've been dealing with it for a little bit longer than 2 or 3 months, and so you're at a place now where you want to treat it. I very much like evidence-based practices, not only because I used to be the evidence-based practice manager and I drank that Kool-Aid, but I think it gives everybody a focus. There is a treatment plan, there is a pace of treatment that I think a lot of young clinicians don't understand, don't follow quite yet. When I was in graduate school, I don't recall being trained in it. I don't recall being trained in termination when I was in graduate school. They just said, okay, here's how you do therapy. And so the idea is that there is a process that you as the providing, the service provider, have an idea. Here's the underlying cause, here's my theoretical orientation, here are the steps that I need to take in order to get you to process through this trauma, and there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the end is not, you've been coming here for 6 months to a year, and you just feel better, and you got bored, or you had better things to do, and so your attendance starts to fall off. So, evidence-based practices, I kind of broke them out by age. We have one at LA Child Guidance Clinic called Child Parent Psychotherapy, and that's 0 to 5. We've got a couple more. These are not exhaustive. There's a long list of about 30 that LA County has adopted, and those are only the ones that LA County has adopted. There are greater ones beyond that as well. These are the ones that I'm familiar with. So 6 to 18, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy and seeking safety, and then adults that have individual cognitive behavioral therapy and seeking safety is also approved for adults through LA County Department of Mental Health. Other things that are essential in providing care for somebody who's been traumatized, again, is you're going to have somebody who is going to perhaps be a little reluctant or avoidant, and so you want to have as many people on the case as possible, case managers, targeted case management, individual rehab, skill building. And then again, outcomes assess the efficacy of treatment, so you can use these same screeners to say, how am I doing? One of the good things about kind of plugging that into your treatment as usual is it reminds you to stay on track. So when dealing with somebody who's experienced a traumatic event, remember their key thing for anybody who's anxious is they're avoiding the thing that makes them anxious. And so by having them review outcome measures, not only to monitor and track your own progress as a treating provider, but also to continue to review, this is why you're here. I'm not going to sugarcoat anything. I'm not going to call, your physical abuse the bad event. And so using those outcome measures allows you to continue to track that. Excuse me while I change it. Reasons why I like evidence-based practice: financial accountability, clinical accountability. It's not business as usual. It gives you a clear path to continue to move through. So if your client comes in and says, I want to talk about the problem we had last week, it doesn't get you off track of your treatment. They're brief, targeted, and effective. These are all the ones that, like I said, have been adopted by, these are the ones that we have, one more time. LA County Department of Mental Health has adopted several that are trauma-informed. The ones that LA Child Guidance Clinic have adopted are CPP, MAP, Seeking Safety, TF-CBT, CBITS, Individual Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. We do have crisis-oriented recovery services, but because of the time limit, they will have had to have come in like right when an event has this happens, so we don't find that we use it as often as we thought we would. And then prolonged exposure. What are people's level of experience with things like child-parent psychotherapy, trauma-focused CBT, MAP? People have little experience, minimum, a lot?
Done them all.
I will go through these a little quicker. CPP, psychodynamic and orientation, some CBT, some social learning and attachment theory. You're looking at the parent-child interaction, and you're really kind of promoting the parent as the curative factor. So the therapist does less interaction. I won't say the therapist does less interaction. The therapist promotes more interaction between the child and the caregiver so that they develop a healthy dyad rather than depending on the adult. I'll give you some vocabulary: protective shield, scooping, ports of entry. So again, you're trying to create the parent as the idealized object, not the therapist. Scooping are different areas where you would create this sort of empathic and holding environment, and then ports of entry are moments where you can scoop. So I cannot remember where I heard this from. I know I'm not the one that did it. I don't want to take credit for it, and I don't want to steal anybody else's if this is actually your vignette. An example was a child and a parent the child had been abused, and with the non-offending parent, and they came in, and the child was reenacting all of these violent events using a dollhouse, and the dollhouse was on a table, like a platform like this, and periodically the people would fall off, the people would fall off the table, and they would disappear, they would go into the abyss. And the beginning of it was just the therapist kind of coached the parent to just be reflective of it. You'd say, oh, that person's gone, oh. And then little by little, kind of coaching the parent on how to respond to the child in an empathic way. And the child at one of the next play therapy sessions, somebody falls off of the character the child identified with had fallen off of the table, and the person that the mother was identified with, the mother spontaneously just took their character and jumped off the table too after the child's character and pulled the child back up to the table, and she looked at the child and said, "I'll never let you fall." That's a good one. And the mom kind of spontaneously figured that one out, and I thought that was really powerful. The strengths of CPP, non-directive and flexible, informed by multiple theoretical backgrounds, strength-based. The challenges that I found are really just the length of time. So remember, you've got folks that are coming in once a week. The minimum for CPP, I think, is 50 minutes. So you're trying to really motivate them, really reinforce them to continue, really reinforce them to stay in. Also, the training process for anybody who's been trained in CPP takes about 2 years. And so you hired somebody last year, and they're halfway through that, and then they get licensed, and they go into private practice, and they appropriately continue their professional development, and they never get certified, and you start over with somebody else. So those are the two largest issues that I've seen. Managing and adaptive practices. Folks familiar with MAP? Yep. MAP is not what I would call an evidence-based practice, and they don't describe themselves as an EVP. It's more of a decision-making tool. It's very good for young clinicians. It talks about that process I talked about. There's a connecting with, or a building an alliance, they call it connecting. There's cultivating, which is then you are informed by multiple number of areas of research, or your own participant, or your own experience, or your own consult with colleagues to pick out a treatment plan that then you list out, and then you follow the treatment plan. And you could refer back to what they call the map to say, like, how's treatment going? So this is the P-Web search. This is decades of meta-analysis research where they would look through anybody who had a successful research program, depending on age, goes to 18 to 20. And then what were the key elements? And so if you plug in the person you're dealing with, if you plug in their name, and if you plug in their age and you plug in their issue, it'll give you all of the practice elements that are associated with a successful outcome, and then based on your own experience, you pick the elements that you want to do, and they give you lists of those elements, or you can bring your own to the table. So it doesn't really tell you what to do, it's more of a process. And again, in sticking with it, you move through the process in about 6 to 8 months, rather than coming in and talking about whatever problem you had last week. So this is not a good focus, but what you can see, the results of this, the results when you plug it into the computer, I can explain it to you. These are the practice elements on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side are the percentage numbers. Those are the percentages of research studies that had effective outcomes that this practice element was involved with. So if you're an anxious person, you plug in, I'm an anxious 15-year-old, and cognitive and psychoeducation and activity selection, this is probably depression, 75%, 62%, then you just pick the ones, either you can based on the highest number of percentage, or you can pick them based on your own personal experience. And then you track them, and they have the dashboard, or what LA County defined as the PPMT. And so you plug in the outcome measures, and you're looking for nice little colored things to start out high and go low, or really bad things start out high and go low, and really good things start out low and go high. And so you can track, these are all the elements that you would have, and then it tracks there's a tab on their dashboard that you can help track your progress. I did have a colleague of mine, and he used to track attendance as an outcome, and it was really interesting because he could show in this graph, attendance was like a yes or no, it was a 1 or a 0, and so it was a black line that just went across, you showed up, you showed up, you showed up, you showed up, you didn't show up, you didn't show up, you showed up, you showed up. And then you can see how the other lines, like measures of self-reported measures of depression and anxiety, would go up and down based on their attendance in therapy. And he was like, so do you want to show up to therapy, or did you want to not show up to therapy? And I thought that was really interesting. Challenges and strengths, decades of meta-analysis, very compatible with other models. Challenges, anybody who works for somebody, if you're not in private practice, if you're in private practice, you get to create your own paperwork, unless you have insurance companies. But if you're not in private practice and you work in another institution, they have paperwork. And I know from personal experience, the last thing that I wanted to get was one more piece of paper that I had to fill out. So some therapists are resistant to working with the dashboard. There are things called pods and cows, problem of the day and crisis of the week. And so therapists and providers can be very vulnerable to drifting away from a process that allows you to move through things quickly, because your client will come in with a crisis or a problem, and you'll say, okay, which practice element is that after the fact that I just did? But you're supposed to be picking that out before they come in. So that could be one of the vulnerabilities. Seeking safety. Seeking safety, the idea behind seeking safety is there are two levels, theoretically, two levels of trauma treatment. If I was sexually abused and I need to process that sexual trauma, but in the meantime, every time I come into my therapist's office, I keep talking about my cutting or my getting into fights or my alcohol use or something like that wound me in jail the other day. It's really hard to get to a point where you're in a safe place to process the trauma. And so what seeking safety theorizes is you have to get them to a safe place before they can get there. And so they have about 25 chapters of a workbook with a number of different coping skills that you handpick with your client to help them get to a place where they're not cutting, they're not drinking these, they're safe enough to get to a point where they can now do deeper, more trauma work. I like the check-ins, I like the quotes. I have quotes of the day, and you have people interpret quotes, and then you do a closing and you have a commitment, so I like that as well. Okay, so we just went through this chapter, we have a quote, you told me what it means to you, we practiced this coping skill. What are you committed to doing this week? Integrated treatment, collaborative. Does not attempt to fully process the trauma. And then TF-CBT. How many people familiar with TF-CBT? Everybody? I like that one. I think So in a nutshell, TF-CBT, I put out practice, PRACTICE. One of the good things about it, if I'm on R today, that means I know I'm on A tomorrow. Somebody's going to come in and they're going to talk about a problem they had last week, or they're going to talk about a decision they have to make, or they're going to say, oh, here's an empathic person that can help me with this thing I'm struggling with. You can, what TF-CBT talks about is spending 5, 10, 15 minutes kind of reflecting and being responsive to what your client is bringing in today, but not getting off track, because you'll be there forever. And you want to get to a point. One of the hallmarks of processing trauma is avoiding processing the trauma. And so every time they bring in another problem, or they get distracted by something, or they had another crisis, that's one day more that you have to wait to process the trauma. And so what they'll do is they'll say, keep moving towards the trauma. As long as you think your client can handle it mostly, you're moving in the right direction. It doesn't mean you don't listen to their problem that they had and help them kind of solve it, but I usually try to fold it into whatever we're working on last week or this week, and how did knowing what you're talking about now, how did you use the skill that we talked about last week? Or, oh, that gives me a good idea. We were going to talk about cognitive processing today, and what you brought up lends itself to that. So I try to fold it back into TF-CBT. I've used it with kids that are 6, I've used it with teenagers, I've used it with adults. I don't know if TF-CBT is designed for adults, but I've used it effectively with adults. Challenges and strengths, parallel process for children and caregivers. Not as much time spent on recognizing the trauma of the parent. So one of the key things is that people who have been traumatized oftentimes will have excessive feelings of guilt. It was my fault. If only I hadn't been there. If only I had done the other thing. If only I had been wearing different clothes. If only I had gone to school like my mom told me to, that wouldn't have happened. And so one of the hallmarks is you have a caregiver come in, or an empathic, supportive adult come in, and they explain their story again exposing themselves to the traumatic memory without having a traumatic response, but then having that adult kind of say, oh, I completely understand what happened. And no, it's not your fault, and helping them debunk some of their cognitive distortions. But if the parent also has their own traumatic experience, that can be a little complicated, and I think TF-CBT needs to focus on that, or I'm telling all of you, I'm asking you to focus on that a little bit more. So I had one, and this is what I tell all my supervisees, thinking like an attorney, you never ask a question you don't already know the answer to. So if you're going to have a parent in the room, or your kid is going to talk about their traumatic event, you've got to know what that parent is going to say. So you have the parent in the room before then, you explain, here's what you're about to hear, here is the right answer, here is the wrong answer. That comes from a personal experience where I did not do that, and the child reported their traumatic event to the mom, and the mom said, I don't know why he can't get over it, here's what happened to me. And I'm like, oh, that might have been timed a little bit better, I wish I hadn't done that. So that is one of the challenges that I'm keeping in mind. And they'll talk about, they'll say it's post-traumatic stress disorder is intense. Thinking you're going to process it in 16 to 20 sessions, that might be, not every traumatic event is going to fit nicely into those 20 sessions. So it's a good place to start. It's good theory. It does work with a lot of people. I've done it with a lot of people that say I feel so much better and I don't need to come back, and I've got outcome measures to prove it. But it doesn't mean that that's designed to be the end all thing. One of the things that they're starting to develop, and may have developed more fully since the last TF-CBT meeting that I've gone to, is complex trauma. So one of the fun things about trauma is avoidance and numbing. So I'm trying to avoid thoughts and feelings about the trauma. If that's a discrete incident, there's sort of a hole in your story. There's elements where you dissociate, or you have memory loss or something like that, or their affect gets really flat and you're looking at this sort of avoidance and numbing. But if you have more than one event, then the avoidance and numbing from the last event confounds the next event. And you have more than 2 events. And remember, the children that I work with up near USC, they've experienced an average of 3 or 4, an average. That means there's some people that have experienced more than that. Imagine what a longer history of shooting, parental violence, deportation, school bullying, you just experience that every day. And like that one 14-year-old I talked about, it becomes normal. Like avoidance and numbing that's just my daily practice. And so trying to pick out one of those events and desensitize them to that or process one of those becomes very complicated. And so they're talking about, instead of processing a discrete event, you would process a timeline. So you started out and you were 5 and this happened, and you were 6 when this happened, and you were 11 when this happened, and tell me the impact on your sense of self, tell me the impact on your thoughts and feelings about your world and yourself, rather than a specific discrete event, the trauma narrative they would do a trauma narrative timeline for more complex type things. And then EVP strengths and limitations, accountability, clinically effective, provides treatment planning so that you can move people through the process. It's targeted, it's brief, it's proven to be effective. But like I said, it's not, we do EVPs and everybody is doing it. I went to a DMH meeting the other day and they started thinking, what's after EVPs? Because EVPs haven't existed all this time, evidence-based practices. Before it was, you would sit in your therapist's office for an hour a week and talk about whatever you felt was important. And then now with Prop 63 and more fiscal accountability from the MHSA, having to do outcome measures and build towards PEI and stuff like that, they're saying, how fast are people moving through the process and what kind of outcome measures are you getting? But it's not the end of the science. We're still developing stuff. So what would be after EVPs? And there would be things that I think what's important about that message is you get young people that say, oh, young, less experienced therapist, and they'll say, okay, TF-CBT, I got to do P, R, A, C, and I'm on C, that means tomorrow is T. And they're very technique oriented without recognizing a larger theoretical orientation that you can use. What is the process of therapy? How do you respond to different things, different dynamics, different cultural issues, relationship issues, different socioeconomic status issues within therapy, legal and ethical issues. It's not just, okay, your next session is the trauma narrative. It's I got to take all of that into account and be mindful of a larger therapeutic process, I think, is the next step up that we work on. Let's see, and then I gave some resources. So if anybody wanted to be trained in CPP, Dr. Mendez-Sherwin is doing that. Seeking Safety through Tarzana. These are not exhaustive. These are just the ones that I referred to when I was the EVP manager. MAP. Good thing about MAP, if you didn't know, is you can subscribe to their P-Web search for a couple $100 a year, and you get all of that good stuff. Doesn't mean you're MAP certified, but you can still use it. So I wonder what's useful for depression for a 15-year-old. I can plug stuff into the computer and get lists of research articles and lists of different practice elements. You have access to those. You just can't call yourself a MAP therapist unless you go through the MAP training. TF-CBT, I refer to a local person, Elizabeth Rivas-Farina. There's everybody knows about the trauma, the 10-hour TF-CBT webinar, the National Stress. Yeah, recently they just raised the price. It used to be free, now it's $35, but still a good deal. It still kind of goes through that process. I'd recommend it for any students in the audience or anybody who doesn't know enough, hasn't worked with trauma very much. It's a good 6 to 10 hour webinar series about all the things that happen to people who are traumatized and different elements of trauma practice that would be good to know. And then I'm glad there are people from ChildNet because I included their address here because they know stuff. Child Guidance Center, Mental Health America, Community Clinic, those are just places that I Googled. But I have worked with folks from ChildNet, I've worked with folks from Child Guidance Center, I've worked with folks from Starview and Children's Institute. We also have some resources down here. And if you find yourself wandering around as far as the 10 up near USC, LA Child Guidance is available as well. Okay. And those are all the slides that I have. I don't know how much time do we have for questions, or did I talk too much? Question.
I have a question. So are the 50 session minimal requirements that release was for one of the therapies, is that going to be about to be the thing of the past? I mean, it just seems like that's going to be hard to sustain insurance-wise, efficiency-wise, fiscal accountability. Like, I just don't see how that could continue. What are your thoughts? And what can replace that? Because obviously the interaction is powerful.
Yeah, I will tell you, CPP, my experience is anybody over the age of 5. CPP right now is like 0 to 6 or 7, I think. And so at my clinic, we use it for our early intervention program, 0 to 5. I'm much less experienced with it. There are two things you're thinking about. One is a funding source and one is clinical utility. So another thing to think about is like certification. So if I say I'm a certified CPP provider, that means I follow all of these steps and I don't diverge from them. If I diverge from them, the more you diverge from them, they call that drift, not being adherent to the model. And so CPP currently says, yeah, the minimum is 50 sessions. I've known clinicians that can provide, so if I want to say I'm certified and I want to say you went through CPP treatment or you went through TF-CBT treatment or MAP treatment, I'm obligated to provide it the way I was trained. Otherwise, you're generating drift. You're creating different versions of the same model that then kind of waters it down. That is if you're, like in my experience, billing to the funding bucket for prevention and early intervention, you have to say, I'm providing an evidence-based practice. I can't unring the bell. If I teach you how to do CPP or I teach you how to do the way I got into the business was through functional family therapy, which I was trying to include in here, and I realized I was a little biased towards it. Very rigorous training program, and talk about Kool-Aid, I drank that Kool-Aid. Doesn't mean you can't provide good clinical services using the model, but not necessarily 50 sessions. So you will not be providing CPP. You cannot represent yourself as providing CPP, but I can't take that knowledge away from you. You can do it in less time. I've known people that have not been billing to prevention and early intervention. They've seen the parents 20 or 30 times, and the kids, the whole number of sessions was 20 or 30 sessions, and they're doing outcome measures, and they say, hey, we think we're doing so much better. There's nothing that says I can't stop treatment. I can't say, oh, you've reached termination, your outcome measures are fine, and sustained over the last couple of months. You just can't represent yourself as CPP. I don't know about changing it. I don't know if there's ideas about, gee, that's a really, really long time, and maybe our clients will drop out a lot. I have less knowledge about that. Does that answer your question? Yeah, I've done, I'm trying to think if there's other examples. I've done cores with adults that will say, they came in, I mean, the model says, okay, step 1, I'm supposed to do this, and step 2, I'm supposed to do this. By step 3, they're saying, you know what, I did some reading, I talked to my religious leader, I went to coffee with friends, and by week number 3, they said, I'm feeling so much better. I don't want to communicate to them, no, you're not better, you have to come in 2 or more. The model says you still have to come in 2 more weeks. So I'm okay with that. I think you just have to be careful not to drift away from how the model tells you you're supposed to do it, and not necessarily to represent yourself as providing that model if you have adapted it so much that it's no longer the same model.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.